Upon arriving in Germany, I became very curious if there was any difference between Germanic paganism and Nordic paganism, or Norse paganism as we call it today. And when doing my research, I thought at first it would become this chicken or the egg debate. Which came first? Was Germanic paganism the root of Nordic paganism, or vice versa? And what I found out, and what actually is the main subject of this video, is the differences between the two. Because at first they can appear very similar, but through my research and what I will be sharing with you today, I found that they are actually two very different faiths that have been kind of sandwiched together because of their similarities. Hello, my name is Jacob, and I am a Norse pagan, and today we're going to be exploring the differences between Germanic and Nordic paganism.
What do you think happened to him?
So as we're getting started with this video, I do also want to mention why I'm saying Nordic paganism now and not Norse paganism. There is a big debate mostly in the scholarly community that the term Norse paganism is incorrect, and it probably is, especially when looking at it, Germanic paganism. When I say Germanic and then Norse paganism, it sounds awkward and odd. And so chances are that we should be saying Nordic paganism, but at the end of the day, this is the term most people have associated with the faith, and so that's why I say Norse pagan. And Nordic pagan just doesn't roll off the tongue as well. But for the sake of this video, I will be using Nordic paganism pretty often just because it combines better with Germanic and Nordic paganism. So to get into the history of both the Germanic and the Nordic sides, it's actually kind of difficult to tell which came first, which is why there's kind of a large debate about it, mostly because of the last ice age, or at least the miniature ice age that existed about 10,000 years ago. If there was any civilization or any tribes that existed in Scandinavia at this time, all information of them would have been wiped out. It isn't until after the ice age that we actually start seeing evidence of people, at least in numbers, existing in Scandinavia. So a lot of our archaeological evidence from Scandinavia comes from around the Bronze Age, whereas in Germany and the Germania, Germanic area, we have evidence to suggest that people have been there for well over 200,000 years. It's some of the oldest artifacts in the world have been found in the Germany region. So we have much more artifacts, physical evidence to suggest that culture existed, and with culture comes religion. It wasn't really until the Neolithic era that it seems like there was society, at least in the Germanic area, and it's after this period, like I said, in Scandinavia that we start seeing society as well. One thing I was thinking of actually while filming next to this lake, it's really crowded so it's hard to actually get up there, but I mean, this is a huge lake. And imagine what it would be like to be actually, a Germanic pagan, in the historical times when this, whole area was just pagans. I mean, imagine what it would be like to be around this lake, worshiping old gods. I mean, that's pretty incredible. I mean, to think that this region, I mean, you can see mountains in the distance here. I mean, the power in that, knowing that everyone around here that sat on this lake enjoyed these views. We're thinking about, nature gods. We're thinking about, something bigger than themselves. I mean, it's hard to say what the faith was like, as you can tell from many of my videos. It's hard to tell what it was like historically, but it still is a wonderful fantasy in my mind to think what thoughts and conversations were had looking at this beautiful lake on days such as this hundreds of years ago. Now, when it comes to the religious side of these things, artifacts don't always give us evidence to, really help on the religious side. One thing on the side of the Germanic, ritualistic, things that we have as far as artifacts is the fact that they use bogs for their sacrifices. And bogs typically keep things pretty well preserved, including the bodies that were actually used in a sacrificial way. And also we have found other things such as swords, like bent swords thrown into bogs, both in the Germanic region and as well as in Denmark. Anyways, so the historical artifacts that we have mostly come from the Germanic side, at least in the the prehistory, the ancient times. Whereas most of our artifacts from the Nordic side come from around the Bronze Age and then even later. So, like I said, with the bog bodies and like the bog artifacts as well, we actually do have really good evidence of offerings. So we can see that yes, offerings were made, but we also know that many of their idols and things that they used to venerate the gods were made of wood and other materials that eventually faded away. But the reason we know about these wooden idols is because of the book sources that we have. If it wasn't for Tacitus's Germania, we would have very little evidence to really build anything off of a Germanic pagan past, or at least knowing anything about their ritual practices or anything about really a lot of things about their culture, just because of what the Romans were recording about them. Now, naturally, as something I've kind of dug up with the Celts as well and the Gauls, is the Romans were really bad about making negative propaganda about the Celtic people and the Germanic people to kind of drum up hatred for them and against their campaigns and to drum up more support. So again, it's hard to say what is actually true in these things. And Tacitus actually, I don't think, ever traveled to Germania himself. He was mostly getting it from reports from other soldiers and people who had been up that way. But regardless, Germania is a wonderful source material for the religious practices of the Germanic peoples, at least in around the 1st century. I believe Germania was published in, I think it was like 98 CE or something like that. It was pretty early on. But like I said, if we didn't have this, we would know very little about the Germanic pagan practices, or at least the pre-Christian Germanic pagan practices. So this is where the tables turn. Whereas we have a lot of archaeological evidence from the Germanic, Neolithic era, and a lot of things to go further back, we actually don't have a lot of information about, basically their time of conversion. We know about Irminsul, we know about, different groves that were destroyed in their campaigns. We know, obviously Charlemagne, but again, we don't know much about practices. Whereas the Nordic side, we have the poetic and the prose Edda, where of course we get a lot of our information from. And this is something I found when I was looking into Germanic paganism, is you actually find a lot of the information brings you back to the prose and poetic Edda. And it's like, oh no, I know this is Scandinavian. And not only is it Scandinavian, it's actually Icelandic. I mean, there really isn't a lot of stuff in the prose and poetic Edda that comes from Norway or Sweden. Most of this comes from the Icelandic sagas, comes from the Icelandic people. So there's probably a lot of information we've lost from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark as well. With the prose and poetic Edda being made in around the 13th century, we have a much more current account of what the practices would have been like, or at least a reference guide to the faith in some way. Now, I should also mention Saxo Grammaticus's history of the Danes. Even though this isn't specifically about the Germanic people, it's about the Danes, so Denmark. It still gives us a decent amount of information, although the actual faith side of things is very misconstrued. It really talks about things such as the lineage of the gods and things like that we see in Snorri's writings as well. But for the most part, most people, it seems like, don't take that very seriously. So what we can tell from these book sources, mostly Germania and of course the poetic and prose Edda, of course, we also have other sources like the Icelandic sagas, and we do have, a few accounts of heathen rituals, at least the one at Uppsala. So from what we can tell, is that the faiths were different. They were still built around, honor and reputation and sacrificing to the gods and things like that. But there were a lot of minor differences, at least from what we can tell from the source material we even have. Things such as the fact that we can actually kind of infer that the Scandinavian Nordic influence actually did have, indoor shrines, indoor temples. There's stories of temples being built to the gods, where the Germanic people seem to have exclusively built outdoor shrines and also built in groves. This was something that was very sacred to them, was building in these outdoor locations, especially things like Irminsul, even their burial mounds, which we see burial mounds, of course, all the way across from Germania, all the way up through Denmark, all the way in through Scandinavia. So this is something that carries through as well. Another difference we see between the Germanic side and the Nordic side comes in the form of the Vanir deities, or the Vonic deities. We see very little reference, if no reference to them, within Tacitus's writing. We don't really see any references archaeologically. It seems like the Vonic deities were fairly exclusive even to Sweden, is what I've been able to find out, is that was where they were primarily worshipped. And this also brings me to the fact that the deities that were worshipped were slightly different as well. From the one account that we have of the third-hand source of someone witnessing the Uppsala events, the Uppsala temple in the pre-Christian Scandinavian times, they honored Odin, Freyr, and Thor. And the primary deities followed and venerated within Germania were Woden, Tyr, which I don't know if Tyr had a different name or not. Honestly, I haven't been able to find that. And then Donar or Thor. And so their deities were slightly different, at least who were focused on. The Germanic people seem to be more heavily focused on the war aspect because they were always at war with somebody, with the Romans, with the Christians, with Charlemagne, with each other. Whereas the Scandinavian, the Nordic, yes, they had, infightings, and eventually they had the raids and things like that. From what I've been able to tell in my research, they were focused much more on things like trade, wealth, agriculture. Yes, they still had the war aspect, but they had other focuses. I mean, they're known as explorers, travelers, and tradesmen as much as they were warriors. At least, that's what we can tell was one of the big differences. So, the deities they follow are going to be slightly different as well. Now, again, this is something I have kind of turned up. Really the key Germanic deities, at least in their language differences, because obviously they spoke different languages, but you had Woden and Donar were the big ones. Now, speaking of Donar, he is the biggest connection we have in the similarities between Germanic and Nordic paganism, and even Slavic paganism, because you have Perun, which is very similar, and a very honored and venerated deity as well. And so you have the Nordic worshiping and honoring Thor very heavily. We have evidence all over Scandinavia to suggest that Thor was venerated. And then you have Donar, evidence all over the place that Donar was, venerated, and then of course Perun as well. So that's probably the biggest thing. Donar is probably the cornerstone of this entire conversation, because yes, there are similarities between Nordic and Germanic and even Slavic paganism, but that does not mean they were, all together similar, or, very much they were not the exact same. We're talking about a very large region that had, varying beliefs among every single tribe, for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. And then you even have, the Scandinavian Nordic side, which is the same. It was a tribal faith. There was no centralized power for any of these faiths. So there was no one central idea. And so even among people in Norway and Sweden and Iceland, there was going to be varying degrees of differences between, the faith and how it was practiced. Very much so in the Germanic side as well. So to me, if I have an argument to make, or if I have a statement to make, is it seems like that Germanic and Nordic paganism are very similar, but they are actually different. And what really has happened is we have more historical information for Germanic archaeology, and then we have more written source material for the Nordic side, and they have enough similarities, or at least they have Thor that joins them together, and so they get kind of mushed together, and they often get wrapped together in a lot of conversations, when at their core, in a historical way, Germanic and Nordic paganism are actually quite different. I want to take a brief intermission, first off to thank you for watching this video, and second off to remind you that if you do like the content here at the Wisdom of Odin, a small donation to Patreon really makes a huge difference. And not only that, I do like to give you lots of benefits, so I've been sharing a lot of my story and journeys here in Germany, as also you get the community Discord and possibly even early access videos. So I have a link down below if you want to support the channel even further. Otherwise, back to this video. As always, what does this have to do with us here in the modern day? Mostly, this is a question I had when I came here to Germany. Is it different as far as Germanic paganism and Nordic paganism? Yes, I do believe they're different. And I think mostly it has to do with the history, how these two cultures developed and changed throughout prehistory, and into the Roman era, and into the, the end of paganism and the end of the pagan era. They're very different stories. And so therefore, the faith and the culture and the stories that they told are going to be different. And it's been really fascinating being here in Germany and seeing the weird, mishmash of Celtic beliefs, Germanic beliefs, Roman beliefs, Catholic beliefs, basically everywhere. I mean, that's honestly one of the reasons that I'm here in a, monastery. Most likely this was built on a spot. I can't prove it, but this is something that was very common, is monasteries and churches were often built on very sacred spots in the pagan era. And then there's things such as beer drinking that are still very common here. There's a sun wheel on one of the, sculptures in here as well. And there's these slight pagan elements everywhere. While it's still Catholic, Germany as a whole is, paganism is sprinkled everywhere. And there might not be a whole book written about it, but there's so many little things all over the place. And it is unique and it is wonderful. But at the end of the day, Germanic paganism is about honoring gods, honoring, the community, honoring your ancestors, and honoring spirits of the land. And that's the same thing for Nordic paganism as well. It's about the gods you follow, it's about, the people that you venerate, and it's about, the spirits of the land and nature as well. These were, three core principles, something I focused on very heavy when I first got into this path, something that is still important to me to this day, because it's something that we can see across many pagan belief systems, and definitely between Germanic and Nordic paganism. Again, you know, one other way to think about it is these faiths fill in the blanks for one another. Like, here's the information that we have about Nordic paganism, here's the information that we have about Germanic paganism. There's gaps between the two. And so throughout time and throughout practicing this faith, people have just kind of slid them together because they do answer questions. And one of my favorite books is Myths and Symbols in Pagan Europe, and that's exactly what it does, is it fills in the blanks with Celtic, Germanic, Norse, and even Slavic paganism to give us a better picture of what Northern spirituality would really be like in a pre-Christian world. I do think I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you so much for watching this video. Again, I hope I was able to make the points clear. I hope I was able to kind of show you what I've been discovering while here in Germany and the differences between Nordic and Germanic paganism. So thank you so much, and until the hall, Skål.